There were massive terror attacks in Brussels, Belgium today, and ISIS has claimed responsibility. ISIS fighters began opening fire using AK-47s in a Brussels airport. This was then followed by a suicide bombing in the same airport and suicide bombings at a Brussels subway station in the heart of the city. In all, 31 people were killed and hundreds were injured. This senseless violence came just 9 days after ISIS carried out a massive bombing in Turkey, which killed 37 people and injured 125. This is the sixth major Islamic terror attack on a NATO member country in just the past 5 months. And 3 of those attacks were directed inside of Turkey. You had the San Bernardino terror attacks, the Paris attacks, and now you have these terror attacks in Brussels. And it's becoming clearer and clearer now that this is an absolute crisis. Islamic terrorism, Islamic fundamentalism, it's a parasite that must be obliterated. The ideology of religious fundamentalism, it's absurd. It's complete and utter fairy tales. You're taking the words of your religious text literally. The dogma and the rhetoric from thousands and thousands of years ago, you're now trying to apply it to the modern world. These terrorists and other religious nuts, you believe in total fiction. But unfortunately, this is reality, and these lunatics, empowered by the words of these fairy tales, they're now going out and slaughtering innocent people. But this isn't Western imperialism. This isn't some sort of flawed American foreign policy. When it comes to many of these terror attacks, the root cause is purely ideological. There's no getting around that. However, I think I can point to a couple potential areas that can lead to these terror attacks. Number one is a flawed immigration policy. The immigration policy of many of these major European countries has been to allow hundreds of thousands of Middle Eastern immigrants into your country with little to no screening or background checks and just simply deal with the consequences later. And Belgium is a country that has a widely flexible immigration policy, and it receives large inflows of immigrants from Northern Africa, Eastern Europe, and certain areas of the Middle East. The process to allow foreigners from particularly dangerous and terroristic parts of the world, it should be extensive. You can't simply allow these types of people inside your country without asking questions first and doing a thorough screening process first. It's not just that flat out terrorists could be allowed inside of your country, that's an obvious concern, but it's also that a significant amount of these immigrants could be fundamentalists, that they could be extremists. But maybe not to the level of violent extremists, but certainly they're fundamentalists and they're extremists, and that is very, very dangerous for your country. Allowing these types of people in your country creates huge amounts of problems down the road. If these people enter the Belgian Islamic community, they're able to spread fundamentalism, they're able to spread extremism, and this fosters the type of environment where terrorists and extremists, they could be radicalized. Now, of course, the answer is not to just flat out stop all immigration from the Middle East. That's crazy. But at least strengthen the screening process. So a lax policy of immigration that could have certainly played a factor in these attacks. Now, another factor is this faux multiculturalism in many of these nations. Countries, these European countries, they'll allow Middle Eastern and Northern African immigrants inside of their country. Many of these immigrants, of course, are Muslim. And while the immigration policy itself is flexible and lax, when these immigrants enter the country, these nations are not stressing that you are now Belgian, you're now French, you're now American, you're now German. You are now having this particular nationality. And part of being a citizen of this nation is adhering to our nation's values. There's no longer any religious fundamentalism or extremism. There's only secularism. Because in this country, we tolerate and respect all other religions and cultures. And instead of this secularism and the voluntary segregation that you see in many of these European countries, where many Muslim neighborhoods are actually separate from the greater community, you have to actually welcome and encourage these new cultures to blend in with the other cultures. You should not be separate, you should be together. And the problem is, many Islamic communities in these European nations, they do not feel welcome and they do not blend in with their nation's culture and values. And this is dangerous because this is how Islamic fundamentalism and extremism can potentially go unchecked in some of these nations. So those are some of the potential root causes of these terror attacks. Now, next point. In times of chaos and panic and terror, people start to go away from rationality and they just move towards complete stupidity and overreaction. This is essentially how the right wing continues to gain power all throughout the world. They strike fear and terror in people's hearts about those dirty brown people who are going to enter your country and kill you and steal your values. And right now, Europe is in a terrible position where its right wing will be able to capitalize. We're going to see more calls to completely close Europe's borders, and in particular to those dirty Arab Muslims. We're going to be seeing more calls to just bomb the heck out of ISIS and just completely root out terrorism. When at the end of the day, of course, the total war strategy that these people are talking about is completely counterproductive. The right wing is certainly going to gain more power in Europe, and it's going to be doing it by capitalizing on these recent attacks, and it's unfortunate. Now, the very last point I want to make here, there's plenty of blame to go around with these terror attacks, and of course also with the rise of Islamic extremism that we're seeing. But what is just as destructive as Islamic extremism is to simply blame Muslims as a whole. Blame does not lay at the feet of every single member of the Islamic community. It just doesn't. Many of the major Islamic organizations across the world all uniformly condemn these attacks. That's the fact. Fundamentalism is certainly a significant faction inside the Islamic community, but the vast majority of Muslims, they are good people who do not want to see innocent lives lost. So I hope that the right wing will at least try to remember all of this before they just start scapegoating the entire Muslim community. Anyway, this was obviously a terrible tragedy, and it's the latest in this long line of Islamic terror attacks, and it's time to start finding real solutions, not just the same old rhetoric.